Hi, I'm Theo, and these broadcasts are to support the blogs on NoMoreShe.com's website as well as the online classes. In this episode, we explore more on the Jubilee, Part 2. Welcome back to the No More She broadcast, where we pick up our discussion on the Jubilee Part 2. Now, the poor. This is addressing the poor, and if you address the least, this is what's true for everyone, but the least, the poor are to be treated as a temporary resident. Say the poor lose their land because they must give it over for a loan, and still they require, because they have to eat, and they don't, do they have a job? So, they are to be treated not as, these slaves like we think of the word slave, but they're to be treated as temporary resident. You cannot charge them interest on your loans, and persons who required selling their labors are addressed in both Leviticus 25 and, as we said earlier, in Exodus 21. And they're not necessarily to be treated as slaves in the sense there's no harsh treatment. They are treated like a hired hand. They are liberated at the Jubilee, and beginning with the closest relatives, the community was responsible to redeem them as soon as possible. Thus, the debt stayed within the community. They were never to be, sold to foreigners. Now, it's to be noted here that neither is the land a slave. Also, again, we reflect the Adamic principle that I argue for in my dissertation of the nature of the connection between earth and earthlings from Genesis chapter 2, verse 7. I first ran into this concept in its initial stages of my thought process through my Pentateuch professor, Dr. Victor P. Hamilton, who's done the Genesis series and the Nikot and the Handbook on the Pentateuch and the Baker. And the land and people both rest and are neither to be overworked. So neither are to be treated harshly. So what's true for the least among you, the poor, is true also for the land. This relationship reflects a three-way harmony then between the Creator, creation, and humans as the stewards of the created order and created beings. So, humans are that bridge between creator and creation, because God places us as shepherds or stewards over the created order. And so we are like God, in a sense, as we rule as his vassal rulers. Again, a lot of this is argued, hopefully in my other videos that will be coming out, and the website as we talk more about Genesis, if it's not already talked about. So, what about some biblical examples of the Jubilee then? Well, we have this kinship redemption mentioned both in Ruth chapter 4 and Jeremiah 32. We have, in the context of Isaiah 37:30, this idea of a double year. So is that what we're talking about? And again, we have a previous video where we discussed the idea of first fruits, but even before that, we talk about firstborn and the double portion, the double inheritance, the doubleness. So Hebrew has this idea of when they want to switch comparatively from, to something superlative. So from good to better to best, they double and triple the language. Holy, holy, holy. By saying it 3 times, that's the holiest of all. And that's in the grammar of Hebrew. So we also have Nehemiah chapter 10, verse 31, and you can check out chapters 9 and 10 to get the context for which this verse has, and maybe it's kind of leaning toward this aspect of Jubilee. And as we said, many scholars are wondering if this is entirely idealistic. It was never practiced. There's theories about the Bible that they never did these things. They never did the festivals. They never practiced them, Many, as we see throughout the scriptures, when you read them, many of the accounts are the prophets speaking against the people because of their idolatry. So they worshiped other gods. So they're supposed to only worship Yahweh, but they worship other gods. in practice. And archaeology tells us they worshipped other gods. And some people try to say, well, see, the Bible is wrong. No, the Bible is a cry against people who do things. And so there is lots of proclamations in the Bible prophetically about the people not worshiping God and not doing the festivals as they should. So there's a lot of that. So yes, they did not practice these things. But then scholars go on both ends of the spectrum, the entire spectrum of saying, arguing this idealistic. And I just wanted to clarify here, there's no evidence for or against its actual practice in the Bible. We can only presume that in some sense they did attempt to practice it at times, but they, just like we in our Bible reading, or, we have those believers among us that only show up we say at Christmas or Easter, or, we have some people that don't show up at all. And, so it doesn't mean just because the people don't practice it that it's not the truth. Anyway, I want to pull away some key theological points. Okay. So we talked about a bit of this earlier, but some of the key takeaways are, again, that only Yahweh owned the land. Exodus 15, verses 13 and 17. Okay. Again, the Creator owns the creation. Only Yahweh. And we go back, we have videos on the channel. There's so many releasing nowadays. There's one on Yahweh and what it means to be Yahweh, and Yahweh being species unique in his sovereignty. And so only Yahweh owns. The people were just mere tenants, remember? In Joshua chapter 5, this is one of my favorite places to go to if you've seen the video or read my paper that I wrote on embodied justice. I love to go to Joshua chapter 5, where when Joshua comes into the land, he asks God, the commander of the Lord's host, the angel of the Lord, who has his sword drawn, are you with us or with them? Are you for us or for them? And the answer is practically really neither. I own the land. I'm kicking these old tenants out, and I'm bringing you in as new tenants. And if you're just as bad as the old tenants, I will kick you out too. That's the kind of the philosophy behind that conversation. So, and they do get kicked out. The exile does happen. So they were supposed to be stewards, again, earthlings, stewards over the earth at creation. And if they're bad, they get thrown out. They got cast out of Eden, and so they'll get cast out of Israel, the land, and lose their identity as God's children. And Hosea gets into that, and Paul uses Hosea a lot to discuss this not my people language, as Paul is dealing with the identity of the believer in Christ. And the argument in his day with the church is Jews or Gentiles, and he says there's neither one. So he's following Joshua chapter 5. Anyway, they could allow others in time of need to take over until the loan could be paid off or the next Jubilee. And that's the idea. So you indentured your land or indenture yourself, and you're hoping that someone redeems you, and God theologically is the kinsman redeemer, the Goel, that redeems his people, but he redeemed them initially from Egypt. So they belong to him. And he demands that all the firstborn, as we said, belong to him in our firstborn series. So go look at that video series. He demands that. And instead he takes the Levites. He takes one entire tribe and says those will suffice in exchange for all the firstborn. And, at the firstborn, all of the firstborn died, because all of the first fruits of the land, the firstborn, all belong to Yahweh. It all belongs. It's this idea that the ownership, everything belongs to God. Okay, that's what we're talking about here, theological point. And so the people belong to God, but when they fall into problem, they can give their land temporarily over to someone else. And you base it on the number of years left until the Jubilee. And so it's until the Jubilee. Okay. You base it on that. So if there's 3 years left before the Jubilee and you get sick and require some kind of help or assistance, or your house burns down or whatever, and you only got 3 years left, you're only going to be able to get 3 years worth of harvest, expected profits given to you. In exchange, you give your land over to someone else for those 3 years. And the same thing for your labor. You give yourself over for those 3 years, and you're paid for what's to come in those 3 years. What the profit expectation is. You get that salary, you get that pay, and then they use you for that, or they use your land. And then when those 3 years are up, then the Jubilee. But if there's 3 years left on your loan, and someone in your family or you yourself come across some means of way of buying yourself out, you can buy yourself out early. Okay. And again, family members can redeem, and the closest they are to you, they are expected to provide the redemption. And it just moves out, and then even, again, you cannot sell anyone to a foreigner. And again, the loan is based on how many years are left before how many harvests are left. Okay. So, as I said earlier, the Bible does not specifically teach the right of inherent personal property per se, but instills rather a corporate responsibility to endure and tame the times of chaos that can happen to all at any given moment. So anytime any of us can fall into a chaotic status where we're in need, and we're, need the loan. Okay. All are uniquely bound to one another, as even they are bound to Yahweh. Again, there's this relationship between earth and earthling and the Creator and creation, and us as created beings and God's stewards over the created order. And we're bound to love God and to love each other. And so we should work to do that. So being bound to Him means being bound to them, because we're all one body. We're one assembly. We're God's people. 12 tribes, but you're one nation under God. This blessing was to manifest in their filling the whole earth with God's glories, reflected in Avram's being blessed in Genesis chapter 12, verses 1, 2, and 3, in order to be a blessing to all families of the earth, which restores what was lost at creation's dawning in Eden. And we'll get into a little bit of this. That is then reflected in the whole Babel incident in Genesis chapter 10 and 11. Thus, Israel is God's tenants of His land, which reflects humanity's role as a tenant of the earth, as its earthlings, by design from the beginning to care for the earth. And so this is all tied theologically together. And it's amazing. Okay? Now, I want to take some stuff from Jonathan Clown's. He's got a book on this, and he's written some articles on this. And the connection between the land and the people and God is important. Okay, so when God's people sin, they sin against both God and the land, and the result is the same as it was in the beginning, in exile and enslavement back to another Egypt in the Babylons, which follows. So, sin, Garden of Eden, exile, Adam and Eve, right? And then where do the people find themselves? They find themselves in Egypt. And God redeems them. He's a kinsman redeemer and brings them out of Egypt into the promised land. And He doesn't give them the land. He gives them the responsibility. He gives them their tenants. Okay, this is not our world. This is our Father's world. Okay, but whenever there's sin, the people are swept off to their Babylon. And the New Testament writers pick on this theme of Babylon. Now, the service of the temple by design in its practices and rituals were to avert such calamity by restoring the cosmos and holding chaos at bay via its various cleansings that cleanse the land and its inhabitants from the effects of sin in the daily sacrifices and the weekly Sabbaths. So when people sin, okay, what's the result of moral impurity? When people sin, and the primary three that are discussed are sexual transgressions, idolatry, bloodshed. So whenever an individual sins, it affects the entire population. So when one Israelite sins, it affects all of Israel. And it even affects the land itself. We're going to get into that. The land being personified in a sense. And so how do you deal with this? Well, the temple is kind of like the filter that cleanses the land. people and the land, the corporate body and the land itself needs cleansed when one individual commits moral impurity. And these are frequently described as abominations. So, the temple is seen as being the way Yahweh chooses to reflect the cleansing of the cosmos and the cleansing of the land of defilement due to these sins. When one sins, the entire land and its people are then affected and require ritual renewal to cleanse that. The sanctuary, then, is God's means of such purification, the temple, the tabernacle. Okay? Annually, it must go through atonement as it spends all year holding the chaos at bay and cleansing the land. So it's kind of like your water filter. It spends all this time filtering, and eventually you have to clean the filter, or the filter becomes so corrupt, you have to get a new one, right? So after 7 cycles of 7 years of weeks, then it can afford the rarefied festival of the Jubilee to celebrate new creation and a new reordering of the chaos on a cosmological scale in the Jubilee. So again, Margaret Barker is good about describing this also in her works. So what we have, it results in the following defilements. Person who does such things, they are defiled. Whoever does the moral impurity, the sin, the land itself, and then, of course, God's sanctuary. And this is going to lead to expulsion from the land if it becomes prevalent. Just like I said, if you have a water filter and you filter and it gets dirty, then, like I have a water filter, it gets dirty, I have to clean it. If it gets so dirty and it cannot be cleaned, it must be thrown out. Expulsion, exile. That's the answer. So what do we have? We have solutions for moral impurity, what are called these abominations that defile sinner, land, and sanctuary, or you have punishment, either through death or exile, which is kind of the same thing in a sense. So, for instance, let's use an example. I always use the example of Moses. When Moses murdered the Egyptian, okay, we think of, the punishment for that. I don't know how much it is prevalent today, but in most of human history, the punishment for murder is what? Death, murder. The person must die, capital punishment. But in Moses' case, he was exiled, and that was good enough. He left the land. He's no longer in Egypt, so he's left. He's cut off from his family. He's cut off from his inheritance. He's cut off from everything he knows, and he's kind of put out in the wilderness to fend for himself, and let the gods deal with it. So out in the wilderness, you have this idea of the demonic or evil, and in the Day of Atonement, you have this concept of the 2 offerings, or the 2 goats. One goat is killed, and the blood is used to cleanse the temple, because again, the sanctuary is the filter. So you have one offering that the blood is used not, again, for the persons. It's not for the people. It's for the temple. The temple has been atoning for the people on the land, and it itself is defiled. After 1 year of doing all this cleaning, it needs to be cleansed, like your water filter. So you have to keep that in mind. Azazel goat is sent out in the wilderness, and, a lot of times it was mistreated. It was kicked and made sure it was pushed over the side of a cliff or something, because they were scared that it would come back, because it represents taking the sin out into the wilderness and letting the demons deal with it. That's where sin belongs. Letting God judge it. And so if you were in the desert, like the desert fathers during the Roman period, they were considered quite holy, because only the most holy could live out in the desert. Okay, only the most holy. Otherwise, it was for the bad people. So Moses goes out in the wilderness. That's typical of the ancient understanding of what to do with it. So, in a sense, he's dead, because he's no longer identifies with us, and he's out there, and let the gods deal with them, and let justice be served, and they'll do whatever they do best. Incidentally, Moses comes back, kind of like an example of repentance. Amazing, so. But it's still kind of, to them, it's the same as death. So to be kicked out of the Garden of Eden was death. Again, Adam and Eve, today, the day you eat the fruit, you will die. Well, they were kicked out of the garden. So it's the same principle, same idea. Obviously, there needs to be restitution, and forms of abstinence are also involved in that. So this is just some general principles from Clowns that I took. We hope you have enjoyed the material in part 2. Please join us for part 3 on the Jubilee as we continue this dialogue next time with Douglas Knight. Thank you very much, and God bless you for listening. Stay tuned for more episodes in videos to help you with your journey from nomorec.com.